The loss of rule of law in America. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. The FBI DOJ raid on Donald Trump's personal residence is a massive, glaring sign of the demise of the concept of rule of law in America. And it doesn't matter whether you like Donald Trump or you hate Donald Trump, or even if you're neutral to Donald Trump. You should not be cheering the FBI's raid, or you should not be defending Donald Trump and his family against this FBI raid if your whole reason for either cheering or defending is wrapped up in your hatred or love for Donald Trump. Take the emotion out of it and look at what's taking place in America with rule of law, the guiding principle of our Constitution. And that's the real tragedy of this raid on Mar-a-Lago. Before I get into that, I want to quickly mention that if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for your faith-based podcasts. Or you can get Bold and Blunt at washingtontimes.com. Or, of course, anywhere podcasts are offered. Listen to this from uscourts.gov. United States Courts.gov, a website posting called Overview Rule of Law. More than 200 years ago, this site writes, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay published a series of essays promoting the ratification of the United States Constitution, now known as Federalist Papers. In explaining the need for an independent judiciary, Alexander Hamilton noted in the Federalist number 78 that the federal courts, quote, were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and their legislature, end quote, in order to ensure that the people's representatives acted only within the authority given to Congress under the Constitution. Let's just add to that it's also a check on the executive, right? The judiciary serves to check both the legislative branch, but also the executive. Okay, so back to Overview Rule of Law from uscourts.gov. The U.S. Constitution is the nation's fundamental law. It codifies the core values of the people's rights, not rights to the government, right? Rights to the people. A recognition of the rights given the people by God, by the Creator. Okay, back to rule of law. Courts have the responsibility to interpret the Constitution's meaning as well as the meaning of any laws passed by Congress. The Federalist number 78 states further that if any law passed by Congress conflicts with the Constitution, quote, the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to the intention of their agents, end quote. That means rule of law. Rule of law takes the precedence. Back to this piece. Quote, nor does this conclusion by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposed that the power of the people is superior to both, and that where the will of the legislature declared in its statutes stands in opposition to that of the people declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. They ought to regulate their decisions by the fundamental laws rather than by those which are not fundamental, end quote. Rule of law as vested in the people, and the people, as we know in America, get their rights from the Creator, from above, from God. Rights that come at birth. And the judiciary is supposed to uphold that core concept of American exceptionalism called God-given rights. The judiciary is not supposed to bend congressional will or bend laws and what comes out of the legislature or bend what comes out of the executive to fit into the executive or legislative will. They're not supposed to bend their rulings to that. They're supposed to bend their rulings first to the people with their God-given rights as recognized and upheld by the Constitution. And then the so-called rights of the legislature and executive come next. Well, that's not what happened with the raid on Donald Trump's personal residence. And the fact that there are too many people in America who see this raid as one of the greatest things that they've ever seen in their lifetimes because they hate Donald Trump, or conversely, see this raid as the most egregious, offensive overreach of federal power that they've seen in their entire lives because they love Donald Trump, misses the mark. Because it should be rule of law first and foremost, and either hatred or love for Donald Trump secondary. Emotions in this country aren't supposed to reign. Emotions in this country aren't supposed to guide how government goes forth and does its governance. It's supposed to be rule of law first. And so when we have things like Stephen Colbert on Late Show coming forth and cheering this raid as one of the greatest moments of his life based on his personal hatred of Donald Trump, that is an indication of how far this country has moved away from the principled concept of rule of law and far down the path of emotion ruling, emotion reigning, which is just a hop, skip, and jump from tyranny.
Welcome one and all. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to The Late Show. I'm your host, Stephen Colbert. It is, what was it today? It was like 96 degrees outside. Thank you all for standing up in this heat and being here tonight. Of course, it may be hot out there. You're the heroes. Stay hydrated. It may be hot outside, but in here, it's Christmas. Because yesterday, we all got the present we wanted. FBI agents raided Mar-a-Lago. That's the most beautiful sentence America has ever produced. It's right up there with "we put cheese inside the crust."
Take note of those people cheering in the audience. Those are the same type of people who would seize your individual liberties if it was done in accordance with advancing their will. They care little about rule of law. They care nothing for the Constitution. And they care zilch for the concept of God-given rights. They only care about their emotions, their emotion-filled politics, pulling them in a certain direction and steamrolling over anyone who dares to stand in their way of bringing about their emotion-filled designs and goals and wishes. These people are the non-thinkers of American society, including their cheerleader, Stephen Colbert, who likes to pride himself on being, at least he did a few years ago, about being this libertarian type person who cares about the principles of America and freedoms and so forth. Well, he's the cheerleader of the ignorant voters of America, also known as Democrats. But look, if you protest, if you oppose what the DOJ and FBI did on Donald Trump and his family in Mar-a-Lago. Simply because you love Donald Trump and think he can do no wrong, you're almost as bad as these cheering fools are in Stephen Colbert's camp. Because again, your viewpoint is being fueled by emotion. If you can't critically think about the Constitution and how this raid impacts rule of law in America, and therefore is the real peril that America faces for maintaining freedoms for the individual in the future, if you can't see that and fight this raid based along those lines, you're also missing the mark. And so I have with me today a great guest. She was former senior advisor and legal counsel to President Donald Trump. She has her own podcast called The Jenna Ellis Show, and her name, coincidentally, Jenna Ellis. Jenna, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Always great to talk with you, Cheryl. Thanks.
So bring us up to date. What is happening on the Mar-a-Lago raid, and how should we respond in America?
Well, so many more questions continue to arise. We've seen that Judge Reinhardt, who, in my view, should have recused himself initially from even signing off on this warrant, has now said that for the public interest and in the interest of transparency, that he is not likely to grant all of the redactions that are proposed by the Department of Justice, with their deadline, of course, being this Thursday. So we're really waiting on that, because here we have to remember that it's the Justice Department's burden to show that they had probable cause and that they actually followed the particulars in the Fourth Amendment in order to obtain this warrant. And so President Trump has highlighted to the media that he intends to file a motion to protect his Fourth Amendment interests, and I think that's a wise move here. So right now there are a lot of questions, and I think to your question as far as how should America react, I think with the exact reaction that we're seeing from anyone with common sense, which is not only to ask all of these important questions, but to be very, very upset with the FBI and the DOJ for what is clearly a political maneuver just 80 days before the midterm elections and against what will likely be Joe Biden's political opponent in 2024, and definitely the Democrats' political opponent.
Here's what I don't get, and I hope that maybe there's some legal loophole that you can explain to me. I've read the Constitution, and many Bold and Blunt listeners probably have as well, and it seems pretty clear that if you want to execute a search warrant, that you have to name specifically the items or persons being searched. It doesn't seem that that was done in this case. Has there been some sort of watering down of search warrants in recent years where police are regularly allowed to bypass that?
Well, of course, that depends on the judicial enforcement. And certainly the Fourth Amendment shouldn't be watered down. There still is precedent that requires that the language of the Fourth Amendment is still applied in every instance, which is exactly what you just articulated, that the persons and places to be searched have to be particularly described, as well as the documents or things to be seized. And here, not only do we not have the particular place and persons in the warrant, but also this was so overbroad, it listed any document for Trump's entire presidency from January 2017 to January of 2021. This is so overbroad that it appears to be just a pretext to go in and search for what? Maybe opposition documents, something else that they can use in the 2024 presidential election, recovery potentially of damaging material on the Clintons or Spygate or the FBI or the FISA court or who knows what. And so what's so ironic here, Cheryl, is that while the left, of course, and the FBI and the DOJ are claiming that President Trump may have illegally possessed documents, it's actually the FBI right now that is likely in possession of documents illegally.
That is rather ironic. Now, see, this is what gets me, that if this can happen to Donald Trump and his family, what would the FBI do to a regular Joe or Jane in America who ran counter to the FBI?
Right. Well, and it's already happening to President Trump's associates, all of the lawyers, including me, by the way, who are being specifically targeted by Democrat operative groups to try to destroy our credibility and damage and ultimately disbar us. And they have openly said that this is their plan, is to try to take away our livelihoods and destroy our credibility. We've seen the FBI raids of many Trump associates' places of residence, their persons. I mean, John Eastman coming out of a restaurant and not even being able to see the warrant before his cell phone was removed. I mean, these are kind of the type of tactics that you would think the old USSR would use, or the Chinese Communist Party. Not here in the United States of America. We still operate under due process, and while the left is screaming, well, no one's above the law, no one is below the law either. And all of the due process protections that our founders intentionally put into our U.S. Constitution were exactly to prevent this type of political operation.
Which raises that big red flag again to me. Is it that our due process has been slowly eroded through the years, or is it all of a sudden, because of Donald Trump and the left's hatred of Donald Trump, that our due process is being eroded so blatantly?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, certainly we've seen how the justice system has gotten away with so much, where they can basically go in and rubber stamp these types of warrants. I mean, look at what happened in the FISA court, and all of these things that are being brought to light. And I think that we are shining a light of transparency because of Donald Trump, and so the deep state and the left is having to work overtime, and they are spending all of their time and resources to try to bring down Donald Trump over the last 6 years, and they're only ramping up their attempts to take him down. And this is also not just about the hoax itself, as Trump likes to call them rightly. This wasn't actually about what Spygate was allegedly about. It wasn't about Russia collusion. It wasn't about the Mueller investigation. It wasn't about a phone call with Ukraine. It wasn't about any of these things. January 6th, none of that. All they're trying to do is to bleed him dry so that his campaign runs out of resources, like what happened right before the 2020 election, when there were a lot of legal challenges that the Trump campaign could have made ahead of November 3rd, that there was some back and forth as far as whether or not those should have been brought, and I have a lot of opinions on that. But the finances, of course, are the issue. They're trying to bleed him dry, and that's exactly what they're trying to do here. This is never about what they say that it's about. It's always about a political opposition in order to try to damage a political opponent so that we, the people, ultimately don't get to select and prefer our leaders. So this is why things like due process matters. This is why the judicial branch has to remain independent. And while everybody is saying, oh, look, Judge Reinhardt represented Epstein, okay, that's a weird fact, but that ultimately, to me, who cares? What matters here is the appearance of bias. And what matters here is that the Constitution is upheld in every instance so that we make sure not only to protect election integrity, but we make sure to protect the whole government system. Because without transparency and without constitutional parameters and protections, then ultimately the bureaucrats in D.C. get to decide our leaders for us, and that is precisely what the founders founded this country against.
What matters, too, is the number of people out there who are actually cheering the FBI and DOJ's raid on Donald Trump's residence. And I know that must concern you as well, but do you think that that's being overplayed? Do you think that there are more Americans who are concerned about the principle and the law and order and the Constitution that's been eroded here than there are people who hate Trump and are happy to see this?
I think honestly on both sides, there is a lack of attention to the Constitution, the rule of law, and civics, because the immediate aftermath of the raid was not okay, let's question what exactly happened here, and is there a justification? Is there probable cause? And questioning that, both sides reacted with their preferred political bias. And if people are Trump haters, then the FBI is the greatest thing ever. And if people are, the Democrats, lovers and all of that stuff, then it was, we're going to absolutely hate President Trump. And if people love and support President Trump, then he can do no wrong. And of course, the FBI is totally biased. And so we have to take a step back here and say, we as the American people can't play into this court of public opinion kind of false narrative. We have to go back to the rule of law, and we have to make sure that it's followed, whether or not your last name is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, for that matter, or Hunter Biden. I mean, the politics and loving or hating the person who is the target should never, ever come into play. Otherwise, we no longer have a justice system.
Yep. That's a crucial point. And that goes back to the founding days when John Adams defended the British, right? It was the principle of rule of law over any kind of emotional fight or political battle. And you said a few minutes ago that you thought this judge should have recused himself. Can you detail why?
Yeah, and exactly regarding John Adams, and that has been what is lost. And I agree with my friend and colleague Alan Dershowitz, who is on the total opposite end of the political spectrum. He's a Democrat. I'm very conservative, but we both agree on the rule of law and that has to be enforced. And that's why we're lawyers. That's why we're defense attorneys. That's why we're constitutional law attorneys. And I wish that emphasis would be better articulated by the mainstream media, which of course it won't, but I hope that everyone listening to this podcast will take a step back and will think about that. But ultimately, to your question about Judge Reinhardt, he had just 6 weeks prior to signing off on this warrant recused himself under the statute for bias, the rule for an appearance of bias on the Trump versus Clinton lawsuit. So if he had an actual bias in that instance, then of course he's going to have an appearance of bias in this case. And it would have been very easy to say, you know what, this is going to be a very high-profile case. I do not even want an appearance of bias, and therefore I am recusing myself. And the fact that he didn't do that smacks of political partisanship, and I think that that fact needs to be litigated. That needs to be challenged by Trump's lawyers, and ultimately I think that was a gargantuan mistake of the judge in this case.
Now, this podcast will post 2 days before the judge is due to release the redacted affidavit. What are your predictions? Do you think it will answer questions or raise more questions?
Probably a mix of both, and more questions than it will provide answers. The judge has said that he doesn't intend to just have a fully blank page and a completely blacked out redacted, but what is he going to actually allow to get out? Is it going to be the necessary particulars that then legal analysts and, of course, Trump's lawyers can look at and can analyze? Was there due process in this case? Was the Fourth Amendment actually followed? All of those types of things. I don't think we're going to get the answers to those questions, particularly if it's a more likely than not, even in the court of public opinion, that the judge just went ahead and rubber stamped this, because then he'll be on hot water. So, again, this is where I think the judge needs to, even at this stage, recuse himself and say an independent person needs to look over this, because he's become part of this case instead of the independent arbiter.
Yeah, because what I want to know is who. I want to know names so I, as a citizen, can research those names and then decide for myself if there was political bias here or not. But I think the names will never be released. Am I correct on that?
Probably not. And, usually on these types of warrants, the judge doesn't even know. It's just labeled as, confidential informant 1. Or something like that. And so those names are generally not released because the prosecutors and the investigators and the FBI and all that don't want to burn their confidential informants. But at the same time, there should be and unmasking in this case, because we do need to know whether or not those are legitimate, credible, reliable sources, or whether this was more or less manufactured as some type of informant that may not have had the ability or the access to the knowledge that they allegedly provided. So there are a lot of questions here, and those things need to be apparent to the American people. And while the DOJ is saying, oh, well, this will harm our investigation, they're the ones that are leaking to the media and floating all of these different theories of the Espionage Act or nuclear documents or, all kinds of other things. So I think the American people deserve answers in this case.
Yeah, it's almost the perfect crime on the DOJ and FBI strategy. They're able to conduct themselves in a way that we're not supposed to question their ethics, and we aren't allowed to get a look at the paperwork that could show whether or not they were ethical. It's brilliant that way for the left. And I know our time is just about at an end, but I wanted to ask you one more question. What are your predictions? You talked about the financial hit that Trump is facing and the Trump campaign and so forth. Do you see him rising past that? And if he was on track to announce a run at the White House in 2024, do you think he still will, or do you think this will put a stop to it?
I don't think any of the left tactics have ever put a stop to Donald Trump, and I don't think that this is going to be the thing that tips that in their favor. Thankfully, Donald Trump has been the one person in American government in recent history that has simply stood firm and has said, no, I am not going to cave. So I don't see that changing. I think that whenever he is on track to announce, and I believe that he will, that he will continue those plans. I don't think that will change. I think this has given him a great momentum, and if he chooses to have a legal defense fund, or if he chooses to just continue to fundraise through the PAC, I think that the Save America PAC, I think that the American people are fully supportive of him. He's the presumptive GOP nominee if and when he announces, and I don't think that any of the Democrats' tactics are going to change this. And thankfully, the founders have given us such a brilliant system of government that that has really foiled all of the Democrats' attempts. And that's why we have due process. That's why we hold prosecutors to a higher ethical standard, so that they are held to ethics, to the rule of law, and if their conduct in this case destroys their case, well, too bad. That's how the system is supposed to work.
Well, I think that's good news. And I think it's going to be hilarious to watch as Donald Trump gets under the Democrat skin once again. Well, Jenna Ellis, I really appreciate your expertise on this, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me on Bold and Blunt. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the latest now is that Donald Trump has filed suit against the U.S. government over the FBI's search of his house. And in his suit, he is trying to prevent the government from looking at certain materials seized without having some oversight from a third party. The suit says the court should appoint a special master, which is usually a retired lawyer or a retired judge, because the FBI potentially seized privileged materials in its search, and the Department of Justice should not itself decide what it can use in its investigation, The Guardian reported. Absolutely. Let's hope that Donald Trump wins on all counts here, because it's not just about Donald Trump and his right to privacy and his right to not be attacked for political reasons by a weaponized FBI and Department of Justice. It's about America's rights. It's about Americans, citizens' rights. Going forward, we need to make sure that our own individual due processes are upheld, and that Donald Trump isn't just the first of a long line of deplorables who will face similar targeted attacks from a weaponized federal law enforcement team. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, or wherever podcasts are offered. And I want to quickly mention, check out my new book, Lock Down: The Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom. It exposes how the left in this country, meaning the Democrat Party, is working with the globalists at the World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, United Nations, and so forth, to seize our individual God-given liberties based on health emergencies, not just for now, but forever. Check it out. It's available wherever books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, of course, or on my own private webpage, CherylChumley.com. I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.